Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
All right, we're going to get started. I'm really pleased to welcome you to the third installment of our Gender Diversity Talk series. We have two great talks today. But before those get started, I'd like to welcome Peter Lee up here, CVP of MSR Next, to give us a quick introduction.
Great, thanks. And I did write notes since I wanted to be sure to get all of the details right on our two very, very distinguished speakers. Before I do that, let me just to set a little bit of context on what the Gender Diversity Lecture Series is about. I think it's been just a terrific series, and we're halfway through now. This is installment 3 of a planned 5 lectures this year. And I think in talking to the organizers, and I'll name them in a minute, there was significant inspiration from a company-wide Q&A that Satya held last October that really sparked a discussion on how to bring more knowledge about the academic research on diversity and inclusion to Microsoft Research. And it makes sense to bring the best research in topics of tremendous strategic importance to Microsoft Research, and hopefully that research can be translated eventually into real action. The series, because of that, was created with the idea of bringing top thought leaders and researchers in gender diversity to Microsoft Research and help all of us by doing so become more innovative partners in supporting a diverse and innovative workplace. And I think it's been really fantastic. The first 2 sessions that we had this year, I think, were really terrific. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time introducing today's speakers, but before doing that, I wanted to just thank all of the people, the whole team that's been involved in organizing this, and especially single out the 3 people who have really been leaders in putting this together, those being Scott Saponis, Jamie Tevan, and Rain Johnson. So please join me in thanking them for doing this. All right, so we have 2 really quite distinguished speakers, and they've thought deeply about the challenges and approaches to solving the issues in the gender wage gap in computer science and in engineering. And I think there's going to be sort of a tag team approach, if I understand the plan. So to start off today, we will have Dr. Catherine Hill, who is the Vice President for the American Association of University Women, or AAUW, and you can see the logo there. And besides being the VP for AAUW, Dr. Hill is also a co-PI on an NSF-sponsored project on women in engineering and computing. It's worth saying just a little bit about AAUW. I spent some time this morning actually on their website, and they actually have quite a bit of very interesting content there if you haven't seen it. I think it's worth spending some time. It's the nation's leading voice in promoting equity in education for women and girls. Interestingly, it was founded way back in 1881, which is quite an amazing thing, and today has over 170,000 members and over 900 college and university partners, including, just verified this morning in discussion, the University of Washington in Seattle. They take and examine positions on fundamental educational, social, economic, and political issues, and in doing so helps to bring the latest thinking in policy and research on these fundamental issues to wider accessibility. Dr. Hill, before coming to AAUW, was a study director at the Institute for Women's Policy Research and an assistant professor at the University of Virginia. She has a bachelor's and master's degree from Cornell University and a Ph.D. in policy development from Rutgers University. Today, she focuses on translating scholarly research into reports that are accessible to a wide audience, including to the media. She will begin today with a talk on the latest data on pay differences by gender in computing compared with other historically male fields such as engineering. And we'll look at both the long-term trends as well as projections for the future. So that's part 1 of 3. Part 2 then will be our second speaker, who I think many of you know already, Dr. Nancy Amato, who is the Unical Professor of Computer Science and Engineering at Texas A&M, where she directs the Parasol Lab. She was also for a time in 2013 and 2014 the interim head of the department. Dr. Amato's main areas of research are in motion planning and robotics, computational biology and geometry, and parallel and distributed computing. She's graduated 17 Ph.D. students, with all but 2 going on to careers in research in either academia or research labs. She has an undergraduate degree in mathematical sciences and economics from Stanford, master's degree from UC Berkeley, and a Ph.D. from the University of Illinois. She was an AT&T Bell Labs Ph.D. scholar, received an NSF Career Award, an ACM Distinguished Speaker, IEEE RAS Distinguished Lecturer, and it just goes on, including being on the CRA Board of Directors and the co-chair of the CRA-W, as well as the NCWIT Academic Alliance. Interestingly, we are having, I feel a little bit guilty. Dr. Amato has to come to Seattle 3 times, I think, in about a 2-month period. She was here apparently just a few weeks ago, and next month is the ICRA conference, which she is the program for which she is the program chair. ICRA being one of the top robotics conferences, and it's being held in Seattle. And so, despite those, she's coming again today, and I'm glad there's a little bit of sunshine. In 2014, Dr. Amato received the 2014 CRA Haberman Award, really quite an honor, as well as the inaugural NCWIT Harold Notkin Research and Graduate Mentoring Award. She is a fellow of both the AAAS and the IEEE. So after Dr. Hild, Dr. Amato will come and discuss how Texas A&M specifically tackled the wage gap challenges it faced and how they increased the number of female faculty to nearly a quarter of the department, and what this has meant for the culture of the Computer Science and Engineering department. That's part 2. And then after that, Dr. Hill will come back to the podium, to the stage, and transition to a discussion on practices that can help women pursue historically male fields like computing. And this will be based in large part on a forthcoming report from the AAUW entitled Solving the Equation, Women in Engineering and Computing. And as part of this, this will include a special focus on ways that men in particular can help create a workplace climate that works for women and people of color. I think we're really fortunate to have 2 such highly distinguished speakers with us today. I hope we can all learn a lot and be inspired to take our learnings into action. So with that, let's have our first speaker. Thank you.
All right. Do I need to talk into this mic, or?
You're mic'd up. You can walk around.
Oh, okay. That's nice. All right. I'm going to start off really simple. What is the pay gap? It's a ratio. All right. I'm not going to stay too long on that because I think you guys can do that math. But the pay gap is an important issue in this economy, and it's been an issue in America for quite a long time. In fact, AAUW's first study was back in 1896, and we found a pay gap back then. In the modern era, the way the pay gap is measured is men and women's typical, not average, earnings, and it's based on either the current population survey or the American Community Survey, and it can be looked at as in terms of hourly, weekly, and annual. Now, and it's always full-time workers, but that's 35 hours or more. So there's full-time workers, and then there's very full-time workers. And sometimes, especially for annual, for example, it includes self-employed and includes annual bonuses. And I bring up all these weeds because the numbers, when you see different numbers, people often think, well, it must be wrong. Oh, it's just not, really counting for everything. Well, this is actually, the reason it varies is because there are many ways to measure it. But we have some historical ways to measure it, which is normally the annual number. Weekly numbers often used, and sometimes hourly. It depends on what question you're asking. All right, so this is just a description of where the pay gap is in terms of the annual earnings. And I share this with you because it starts back in 1960 and moves all the way to basically the present. And it shows you that there really have been 3 periods in terms of the annual pay gap. And one reason, by the way, we continue to use that annual number is that it has this historical background. For the weekly and hourly earnings, we don't have that same data set in the same way. So what you'll see here is that there was a big increase in the pay for women through the periods of 1980 to 2000. And since then, it's been pretty flat. And in the beginning was pretty flat. So the question in terms of where we're going with the pay gap depends a lot on which trend you think is going to be most representative of where we're going in the future. Are we going to have a lot of social change in the future, or are we going to have more of a stagnant or flat pattern? I wanted to point to education because this is one of the big reasons behind the improvements and gains in the pay gap for women in the 80s and 90s and 2000. So what you see back in this is the 70s and goes back up to a little past the 210. And what we see is that women have made gains, a lot of gains in education. So this is the percentage. In fact, in bachelor's and master's degree, in 1982, roughly 82, we saw that more women were getting degrees than men. And that's still true today, although it's sort of leveled off. It's not continuing to climb. Likewise, in the doctor's level, the Ph.D. level, we're now at slightly above parity, slightly. So this tells you a big piece of the story. But what we have to question now is when we look forward, going forward, where are the new gains for women's employment going to be and for women's wages? Okay, I want to show you just a few other things about the overall number, and then we'll focus in on computing, and I will look in at college students. So overall, this is the weekly earnings, but what you see is that women and men, we see a gap at every level of education. So, but less of a gap at the high school and less than high school and associate's degree level, and a bigger gap at the professional level, 74%. And so it's interesting, education, of course, was really the crux of how the pay differences narrowed so much in the past, and yet we see bigger differences among men and women in terms of the pay in professional fields. You'll notice, just for all of you with a PhD, you'll see that the salaries go down a little bit with the PhD from the professional field. So you can feel and make your friends who are in doctors and lawyers can pay for your lunch. So your earnings by age is another important factor. Of course, when we start out, young people earn very similar amounts. There's a smaller gap, 90% in ages 16 to 19. And of course, during the prime earning years, during the years of in your 30s and your 40s and your 50s, when you're making the bulk of the income you're going to bring in, there we see a larger gap in men and women's earnings. And this, of course, is by race and ethnicity, and we see gaps across the board, but the gaps are really different in different racial groups. So for white and Asian men and women, we see a gap of 78 and 79%. In the other fields, it's a smaller gap. So the gap itself between Hispanic and Latino men and women is only 90%. Of course, you also have to consider the overall earnings, because in fact, we don't really want to close the gap, right? We want to raise women's earnings and raise men's earnings. We don't want to close the gap at all costs. I wanted just to point out that when we talk a lot about pay, but we need to look a little more broadly than just pay. We need to look at all the benefits and compensation. I think all of us are probably aware of the different kinds of compensation that is tied to our paychecks. So pension plans are often tied to our paychecks. And so over time, we see that men are the darker color, the brown or mustard yellow, and the gray is women. So what you see is that it's more likely for educated men to have pension plans than for women to have their own pension plans. And that's, of course, important. And it's one of the reasons why we see women having being so much more likely to be in poverty in their old age, is pensions and other kinds of savings, of course. All right, well, this should be sort of familiar. I don't know if you can read these, but this is just a regular everybody, civilian employed population. This is computer programmers, computer support specialists, software developers, computer systems analysts, industrial engineers, electrical, mechanical, and civil engineers. So let's go back to, say, software developers. There's an 87% gap between men and women in that field. And there's a similar gap among between computer programmers. Here is actually a 92% gap, and that's actually really fairly small. And so what we have to say is that within computing, the gaps tend to be much smaller than they are elsewhere in the economy. This is the rest of the economy. And in computing, we do see differences, but they're not as large. If you want to understand the next question, of course, before I go on to answering that question, I want to just address the question of sort of why all this is so important and why is it so important now? And it's because we've seen a real sea change in terms of how people are living, in terms of the households that people are living in. And back in 1960, very few people were single mothers. It was very uncommon for women to be the ones who were supporting the family when they were co-supporting the family. Today, that's changed a great deal. Today, 25% of mothers are single mothers, and another 15% are jointly bringing in income, a large percentage of income in the family. So about 40% really can be looked at as breadwinners, and that was not the case in the past. So what women earns matters a lot more to women today, especially those who are having kids on their own, are not in families with men, or just are single. All right, so of course, one of the questions that I think you probably all have is, okay, so what are you taking into account? Are these gaps real? What are they based on? Are they based on women's choices, or are they based on things that women have no control over? And I'll give you a heads up. The answer is it's both, of course. But I wanted to talk about a study that we did at AAUW where we looked at men and women at a point in their careers when they're more similar to one another. So we looked at college graduates 1 year after college graduation. We use a data set that is available on the website for anyone who would like to use it. It's called the Baccalaureate and Beyond data set, and it's in the National Center for Education Statistics website, and it's free, and they have something called a PowerStat tool. So if you want to try to reproduce any of our numbers, you should be able to do that. This is not a full apples-to-apples comparison. That's a little bit of an overstatement. It's not. But this is a group of people who tend to be, most of them were childless. They are not yet married. This is the first time all of them are going to be working full-time. We're not looking at the people who went on to grad school. We're just looking at the people who are working full-time and not in school. And they came from similar colleges and universities and similar grades, and we looked at all of these and found a pay gap of 82%, 1 year after college graduation. And this was really interesting to us because we had a lot of, these guys have a lot in common. Well, we took a careful look at what some of the main issues were, what was driving these differences. And one issue was college major. Women were more likely than men to major in some of the fields that did not get higher salaries, the humanities, social science was sort of mixed, but surprise, surprise, computing and engineering do very well in terms of salary right out of college. Better than, in fact, a lot of other professions where you need to get an advanced degree to really benefit from your education economically. Okay, so we looked at hours worked was another one we looked at. Women tended to work less hours by about 3 hours a week. The college major, differences in college major, differences in occupation. So women were more likely to go into, say, a math major might go into teaching as opposed to a firm. So some of these things are about people's choices. But what we did is in a regression analysis when we looked at all these things that we know affect earnings. And what we found is, yeah, it did explain a big chunk of it. So we got to 93% that could be accounted for by all the variables that we could find, which suggested there's a small amount of difference that was not, we can't account for. Now, it could be a lot of things. It doesn't have to be discrimination. But one of the things we were interested in is discrimination because we take a look at the experimental data. And that's something we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about a number of different studies where we see that men and women both don't consider women to be quite as good as men in mathematical tasks. So I think that this raised some questions for us and made us want to take another look at this information. And some ideas for action I wanted just to throw out now, and maybe we'll talk more about this later. But some of the things that we've seen in our conversations with both employers and also with media and other folks who have been reached us on this issue, people have experimented with using initials rather than names on a resume. Conducting a job audit to monitor pay across companies, different parts of the company. That's also something that's not always done. This is an idea that may not work for computing, but it's an interesting idea of setting a price for the job. Like you get paid $80,000 for this job, and that's the price, no negotiation. If you want a different price, you have to be promoted to a different job. And that's because there are differences in negotiation strategies for men and women tend not to negotiate as much and also so lose out on some opportunities. And of course, the idea is one of the things we don't see is enough women going into the technology and engineering fields in general. So that's really something that we need to be doing in terms of women's choices, is helping them envision that these fields can be for them. And another issue we look at is the question of transparency in pay, which is always a little controversial, but there's different levels of transparency and different ways to talk about it and think about it at your company. So those are some of our comments on equal pay.
So thanks for having me here. And Peter, I have to say that I don't mind coming to Seattle that much because I'm actually from here, and my parents are very glad that I have been coming so frequently. Although this trip is pretty painful because I left after my class yesterday, and I'm going to take the red eye back tonight so I can get back in time for my class tomorrow morning. So what I want to talk about is some kind of more specifics about how we've dealt with some of these issues at Texas A&M. And I'll first start off talking about some institution-wide salary analysis that we've been doing and how we're using that to basically make changes. Then I'll talk a little bit about how we've increased the number of female faculty in our department from about 8% to around a quarter now. And then I'm going to give a plug for some of our CRA-W programs that we've been using to, I think, have helped us in, with the latter part there. So first off, basically, I'm going to start off and tell you a little bit about my own experience. But basically, state universities usually have fairly typical uniform starting salaries as assistant and a standard raise on promotions. Annual raises are basically determined pretty much entirely by the department head. And at Texas A&M, like many state universities, our salaries are publicly available. You can find them online. So that solves some of the transparency issues which companies have, right? You don't really know how much that person next to you is making necessarily. But here's just some of my experience. I started at Texas A&M as an assistant professor in 1995, and I've been there ever since. I was basically promoted early to associate, so in 2000, and a little bit early also to full in 2003. So you would imagine that I was doing pretty well, okay? So when I got promoted to associate professor, there was a guy, I don't know who it was, I have a suspicion, but somebody would go around our department and they would make a photocopy of all the salaries for our department they'd go to the library and get that, and they put it in all our mailboxes. So when I saw that, right after I was so proud I'd been promoted and all that, and I thought I had a pretty good raise. Well, I looked, and my raise of 5%, which I thought was good, was less than some people that were still assistant professors, just kind of, and ones that I knew weren't doing that great, and they'd have like 10, 11% raise. So I was like shocked. So I talked to my department head, and I remember he still came to my office, and I remember him writing on my whiteboard, and he said, those of you who don't know, my husband's also a faculty member in computer science and engineering. He, though, came a few years after me, so he was still an assistant professor at the time. But he told me, like, Nancy, you and Lawrence together make almost as much as me. And I'm like, so what? How is that? What's the relevance there? And then he also told me that these two assistant professors that I noticed had received much higher raises than I did on my promotion year, remember? That they had families, they had wives and children that they needed to provide for. So I was just honestly flabbergasted, and I'm not that shy, but I think it was pretty clear that I was pretty upset. So, but I'm like, well, what can I do? So then about 6 weeks later, I get a note in my mailbox that there's been an error and it's been corrected. And I then had a 10% raise, which I later on found out everyone's supposed to get a 10% raise when you get a promotion from, assistant to associate or associate to full. So I really don't know what's going on there, but that was one of my experiences. And then when came time for me to go up for full, I did want to go a little bit early, but I wanted to go up you basically decide when you're going to put forward. You have often no choice for the assistant to associate. I did choose to go early at the time. That's another long story I want to share with you. But for the associate to full, I wanted to go a little bit early because I wanted to go on sabbatical, and I did not want to have to deal with that process while I was on sabbatical. And I thought I was doing pretty well. So I went and I talked to our associate head, he was kind of in charge of the promotion and tenure committee. So he was the right guy to go talk to. And he'd been sitting in and doing the annual evaluations of me every year with the department head. So you would imagine that he would be familiar with my record. And what he told me is, he's like, Nancy, people don't get promoted to full professor for service. And I was like just shocked because I thought I was doing pretty well in terms of research. And so then I thought, oh boy, maybe I'm not doing that well. So I went to actually one of my colleagues, the only other female professor in the department, and she was on the promotion and tenure committee. And I asked her, hey, Jennifer, can you look at the letters I got when I was promoted to associate? Maybe there was something wrong with them. Maybe they weren't good. And so she checked, and she came and she told me, no, they were really good, don't worry about it. So I didn't worry about it. I went and it worked. But basically I got that negative feedback that I wasn't somehow good enough to or ready to go for full. And I think that this happens frequently. Basically because he knew I did a lot of service, and so he kind of somehow thought, well, if you're doing that much service, you can't possibly be a good researcher too or something. But he was evaluating me every year. And then the other thing is that I kind of got a more global picture of how things work. A year ago, I was our interim department head, and basically the department heads are pretty much solely responsible for deciding what the raises will be for all the faculty and the staff in the department. The department head proposes the raises. You typically have some raise pool, which you are given some parameters as to how you can allocate it, and then the dean has to approve it. But basically, they're pretty much just agree to what you do. So now I want to tell you about something that Texas A&M has been doing, which I experienced as the department head, and I think it's a really great thing. So We have an advanced grant from NSF, and this is, if you're not familiar with the NSF Advanced Program, it's a program which is basically trying to help institutions make change with regards to gender equity in their institutions through maybe leadership, promotions, pay, many different aspects. And Texas A&M has a grant. And part of that program is they do an annual university-wide analysis of the pay for all the tenure and tenure-track faculty members. And what they were trying to do, the initial goal, was to see if there's any difference between the male and female pay rates. And correcting for things like years in rank, et cetera. And they were also used this as an example to see if there were any differences based on race and ethnicity, and also natural origin, were you native born in the US or not. And so they were developing some kind of statistical measures just to see if there were any issues. And then they also were flagging individuals. And both of those things have been very effective, and it's been so successful that the university's committed to continuing this after our advanced grant expires this year. So how does it work? The researchers were, actually they're both from Texas A&M. One is a social scientist researcher, and another one is a researcher basically working with the Dean of Faculty's office. But they wanted to come up with a predictive model for salaries for the tenure-track faculty that's based on, oops, that's one of my edits, based on 10 years of data. And they were trying to use demographic variables such as gender, title, age, race and ethnicity, the years in service. It does not account for productivity, okay? So, but it's just things that are measurable, okay? And they come up with these models. And they developed a separate model for every college, and they allowed for different indicators within the departments, okay? And they got input from the deans and department heads into this model. I will talk a little bit more about that later. So here's some results of what happened, just the statistic-wise from our last one that we had. In the College of Engineering, so computer science and engineering is in the College of Engineering, as well as ECE is also in the College of Engineering. So all the computer science faculty are in engineering. And what you can see here, this is so this is for College of Engineering, Science, and Agriculture and Life Science. They have things like biochemistry and biophysics in there. But this is the female salaries as a percentage of the male salaries. And in engineering, you see that the women are making 102% of the male salary. So they're doing a little bit better than, on average, than the men. Now, there are many fewer women, right? But it's very similar, basically. Just looking at these numbers, they're really, it seems like engineering's doing pretty well. And it is, in fact. In science, which includes math, biology, chemistry, and statistics, the women aren't quite the same as the men. And in some of those departments, there are quite a few women, but still men are a majority. Now, in ag and life sciences, they broke it up into the ones that are considered in the STEM fields or in the non-STEM fields. And interestingly, in the non-STEM fields are doing worse than in the STEM fields. But in the STEM fields, we don't have as many women, generally. Here's another one that's, I think, interesting, and we're looking at this for using ethnicity and natural born. Okay, so basically, there's 3 values for each college. Asian as a percentage of the white salaries, other non-white, so this would be like Hispanics and blacks, et cetera, as a percentage of white salaries, and foreign born as a percentage of the native born. So in engineering, it's looking honestly pretty good. The Asian salaries are 99.3% of the white salaries. The others are 99.4%, and basically parity here for the native versus foreign-born. Some of the other colleges are a little bit worse, but overall, these numbers look pretty good. But they didn't always look like this. These numbers have improved over the last 3 years, really, because of these analysis. This is the one that I think is more important, honestly, than the averages, because the numbers are really big. So in engineering, for example, we have around 400 faculty. So I think that's, from what I've heard, that's about the same size as like the Microsoft Research number of Ph.D. researchers. So on the same order. So those are numbers are honestly big enough that averages aren't always that useful. But another thing that's done is individuals are flagged. And this provides a report to the deans and the department heads identifying faculty whose monthly salaries are not in line with that predicted model. Now remember, that model does not account for research productivity. Okay, it's not quality. It's just age, number of years at rank, et cetera. For each one of those individuals that's flagged, the department head has to either provide a justification or address it. So the justification can be really simple. It's warranted by, productivity. Then the dean must review that and submit that report to the dean of faculties. Now, you have to be careful. I had to do this as the interim department head, and there were individuals in our department that were flagged. None of them caused me to actually make a salary adjustment for the tenure track faculty. But I did get another report, which they've started running, on the teaching focused faculty, and I did make one adjustment based on that. We had this is all recorded. We had someone who was significantly underpaid based on the statistics, and by 20%. And I was able to justify putting forward a 20% raise when we were given a 2% raise pool. But it was basically because of the statistics that I was given that I was able to do that. Now, when you do have to be careful. You can't just write warranted by productivity, because then the dean is going to look at your annual evaluations that you're putting forward, and if that person is not getting, if they're not getting a negative evaluation and they're underpaid, that's going to be a problem. So these are taken very seriously. But I found this really useful, and I had no idea it was being done, honestly. Although it's very public in the reports on the website, it's just something they didn't really talk about too much in terms of this, but it has had some impact. So here's to show you kind of the percentage of individuals that get flagged. So in engineering last year, in the 24 one, so these numbers, so in engineering, there were 5.3% of the faculty, female faculty, that were flagged because their salary was lower than predicted by this model, and 5.8% of the men, okay? And there were 5.3% women that were flagged because they were higher, and 8.7% of the men were flagged. And for the other colleges too. Business, was kind of interesting because they didn't have any that were flagged to be too low, but they had a number that were flagged because they were very high. But this, it is, even after the third year of doing this, there are still individuals that get flagged through this process. And initially, when they started doing this, it was met with distrust by the deans and department heads. They basically did not want to have to deal with this. They thought it was going to be bad data and just another thing that they were going to have to deal with. The PIs who ran this study, they basically went around and met with all the department heads and the deans, and they made sure that they spent serious time with the departments who ended up with a lot of faculty that were initially flagged. Okay, they realized where those problems were going to be and spent time with them, and they got feedback on the model, and in fact they brought in other variables to the model. So one of the things, for example, that they ended up adding to the model that they originally hadn't was the rank at higher. So that when people came in and like an associate or full professor rank, their salaries tended to be higher, and so that needed to be adjusted for appropriately. And that came from the College of Architecture, for example. And then that helped them, basically kind of improve the model, and also, they could explain it to the faculty and the department head so they know where it was coming from. The Dean of Faculties finds this extremely useful, and they're planning to continue with this after this program is, the advanced grant's over. And they said that, initially the deans and department heads were unhappy with it, but now they they believe it, and they're, it's just kind of part of the annual, salary process. And they said that, our dean of faculty said that every year 10 to 20 faculty get raises because they show up on that report. And it's not just women. I mean, it's helping everyone. It's better for the whole institution, really. And it's something that maybe came from this advanced grant that was focused on women, but it's been good for everyone overall. So this study was done by Lori Taylor, who's a faculty member in our Bush School of Government and Public Service, and Jeff Freud, who's in the Dean of Faculty's office. Lori's very happy to answer any questions or if people have questions about it. And we have this report is online, and actually the previous ones are as well. So if you have any questions about this, I'm happy to try to take them. But if you have methodological studies questions about the study, it'd be better to go to Lori. But I have used it, seen it from the perspective of a department head, and it was, I think really valuable, frankly. In my experience, I think that overall most people aren't, evil. They are just, everyone I think kind of agrees that diversity would probably be a good thing. Sometimes they're just not knowledgeable about it. And sometimes there's also just a general lack of sensitivity. They're not aware. And so we end up with a lot of unintended difference in treatment and expectations. So for example, from my personal experience, when I went to Texas A&M, we have an industrial affiliates program like most universities do. And typically what would happen is the new professors would be asked to give a research talk to the, brief research talk to the industrial affiliates to let them know what they're up to. Well, the day before I showed up in January, which is kind of unusual. And so normally it's in the fall when they have the professors the new professors give their talks. But I came in January, and the day before this meeting, our department head, who had hired me, right? So he obviously thought I was a good addition to the faculty. He asked me to come and talk to our industrial affiliates about women in computing, and not about my research. And honestly, until that point, I hadn't really done anything with women in computing. I didn't know anything about it at all. So I knew that they were starting some women in computing group at the University of Illinois when I left, but I honestly hadn't been too involved in it. And so I didn't really know anything at all. So I frantically was trying to find information, and I did that. And then I started the Women in Computing group in our university, which is, in our department, which is going strong today, and I'm really glad I did that. But, that was not how it was kind of different that he treated me that way. And often we're asked to do extra service, and I like to do it. I still do it a lot today, and I'll talk to you a little bit about more later on with CRA-W. But then when I was trying to go for promotion to full professor, because I'd done all this service, he's like, that's how he kind of, pattern matched me. Nancy does service, and didn't think about me in the same way as he did about the other people who maybe weren't doing service, because he didn't know about those other things about then. And so it was never, no one ever meant me ill, but it just kind of colored the way they thought about me. And so I think that there still are some things that are really done for bad reasons or that are really prejudicial, but I think for most cases it's not that. It's more benign, but it ends up hurting a lot of people. So we really need to improve awareness. Here's something that happened at Texas A&M just in terms of our faculty. When I started in 1995, I was the second woman in the department, and then I was still the second woman up until about 2001. And then at that point, we hired the next woman, who many of you know, Valerie Taylor. We hired her as our department head. And then we hired, since then we've been kind of steadily growing, and now today we're about 25% women, which is quite high for a research, department. And we also have ethnic diversity among those women. We've got 2 African Americans, 1 Hispanic, and 2 Asian women. So how do we do it? Well, I think it really requires, grassroots buy-in. Institutional practices. We have required training for all of our search committees. You probably have things like that here too. But it used to be, originally they just made the chair of the search committee go, but now they make everyone go, and you have to go every 2 years. It's frankly pretty annoying, but you have to sit here and listen to all that stuff, and it reminds you things are important, and it reminds you like those questions you're not supposed to ask and those kind of things. And it just makes the whole process, I think, work better. And then we've also been really good about sending our faculty and our students to external programs that helps them build a community, because even if you don't have that locally, they can build that community nationally or internationally or within their research group. And I'll talk a little bit more later on. I want to make sure that you guys all hear about the CRA-W and the great programs that we have. But they've been really, really helpful for me and for many of the others in our department. And then I think something that's really kind of key is that basically leadership. In our department, since basically from 2001 up till now, we've had female department heads, except for 2 years. At 2001, 2002, Jennifer Welch, the other woman in our department, she was the interim department head. And that's the year that we hired Valerie Taylor as our department head. So then Valerie was our department head for 8 or 9 years, I think, 2 4-year terms plus that last year where we're looking. And then we had a male department head for 2 years. Then I was the interim department head for a year. And we hired Dilma Da Silva, who's just started as our department head last fall. So I think that this really does impact your ability to kind of have a good culture within your organization and also to recruit and retain people. So then the last thing I wanted to talk about is to make sure you're all aware of the CRA Committee on the Status of Women in Computing Research, or CRA-W. How many of you have never heard of it? You all have? I find that hard to believe. But maybe that's because why you're here. Oh, okay. So, okay, but that doesn't mean you all came. Okay. So you all know about these things. Well, this is like one of the best groups I have been involved in my career, honestly. I've been involved with it as a board member since 2000. And every committee member, in order to be on that committee, you have to have a project, and you get evaluated, and you are, removed. Maybe not immediately, but it doesn't take too long if you're not, doing your job. And you guys here at Microsoft Research should be really proud of this too, because the last two, it's governed by co-chairs, which serve 3-year terms, and the last pair of co-chairs included Catherine McKinley. And she was co-chair with Tracy Camp from Colorado School of Mines. And now I'm a co-chair with AJ Brush. So we've been doing this for, it started in September as a co-chairs, yeah. So, okay, well then I really won't spend too much time if you've already all had this. But basically, CRA-W has programs for undergrads, which are research experiences. The DREW program, I've been running that since 2000. I think it's a fabulous program. That takes undergrads from all over the country and matches them with faculty at universities for summer research. And AJ was, when it was called DMP, but it's really effective. And then the grad cohort, this is something that Microsoft Research is one of our main sponsors, and we're really grateful to that. But that program, it gets almost all the graduate women in the country basically participate in grad cohort at some point. And I think almost all the PhD students. And it brings them together for a 1.5-day workshop once a year. And it's been really effective. And then we have career mentoring workshops for people that are early in their career, like senior grad students, beginning researchers and professors, and then mid-career.
And I know at least one person's coming to the mid-career that's in June in Portland, but we can get you in. We have space, so.
No, it's a great program.
It's
yeah.
really good.
So it's at FCRC, and if you can still apply, I believe. I'm not sure if they're.
Or send me.
Yes, AJ can get you
I'll
in.
get you to the right.
She has an in. But the other thing I wanted to make sure you knew about was CERP. CERP is the Center for Evaluating the Research Pipeline, and this is something that CRA-W started as part of our grants a few years back, and it's really effective. What it tries to do, so we always want to evaluate these programs to see if they're effective, and it's kind of obvious, right? You would imagine that undergraduate research experience should be good, right? But we wanted to evaluate and compare like our programs versus students that participated in other types of programs versus students that didn't participate at all. And that was difficult to do, and NSF, who funds many of our programs, wanted us to do that. So you may have heard of the Data Buddies project. This is where many universities are participating in this. They allow their faculty and their students to be surveyed annually. And so we can capture data about students that participated in like undergraduate research experience or who didn't. And so then we can compare the effectiveness of like those programs, like a standard REU, to the REU programs run by CRA-W. And here's some things that we found out. For example, we have more later data, but these ones showed that basically if we looked at the graduates of our programs, the green were graduates of our programs, the orange is they did research experiences as undergraduates, but not through our programs, and the blue is they didn't do any at all. So if they were going to be enrolled in a program, our graduates were about twice as likely. 81% of them were in Ph.D. programs versus 37% who did like a regular REU, and 18% of non-participants. And generally, we have good results showing the effectiveness of our like grad program cohort programs as well. But this is an evaluation that shows that these programs really are effective, and we need to do more of them. And we're really grateful to Microsoft Research's support of these, and Rain in particular. So I wish she was here, but So anyways, these are kind of the main points I wanted to make, is that I think that this salary analysis institution-wide was good for everyone. It helped identify anyone who was getting, inequitably paid and made their manager have to explain it or fix it. And increasing the number of female faculty, it took time. I mean, it's taken like 20 years, but it's really changed the culture of our department, and it's made it a better place for everyone again. Fixing these problems makes it better for everyone, not just for the women. And the CRA-W programs have been an important part of at least our department's progress in this regard.
All right, so let's invite Catherine back up here. She has just a few more things to tell us about.
Yeah. In fact, I'm gonna go through all my, I'm not going through all my stats and stuff here. So what we'll do is we're gonna skip ahead to the end, because this is a really important study that I wanna leave you with. So we're just gonna talk about one more thing. And if you want to see a bunch of stats about where women are in computing and engineering, you can always download the report on AAUW's website. But this is a study by Nadia Fouad and her colleagues. And she did a study on engineering, but I think this study on engineering is very relevant to what you're all doing here in the computing field. So this is about retention. And what she looked at was a survey of women who had gotten a BA in engineering at some point, and she looked at where they have gone and what they were doing. And if you look at women and men right in the beginning, right after college, you see that about 60%, about the same, went on, of the people who got the degree, went on and got a job in industry with their bachelor's degree. Others may have gone to graduate school, they may have gone to a different field, we don't know what they did. So these are the years since they graduated. So this is 0 to 4, so you graduate here, and now we're at 10 years after graduation, and here we're at 20 years after graduation, and we start to see a little bit of a shift. And then when we get down to 30 to 35 years, 34 years, we see a very large difference between women and men. So the yellow is women, and the blue is the men. So at the end of that time, we still see these people in the workplace. And what's interesting is she asked them, so she decided to look at these two groups, the women who stayed in and were in the workforce with engineering degrees, and women who had those engineering degrees but had left within the last 3 to 5 years. Yes?
If you're looking at 0 to 4 years, you're culturally looking at a very different kind of clique of people now than when you're looking at 34 years, which is like 1980.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is there some way that these differences in gender can be kind of normalized against this curve?
Right. Well, the reason it would be ideal to do that over time, to look at the same people, but it's just, obviously you can't. So that is actually just an artifact of this study. You're going to see that the people at the end are different people than the people at the top. And so there may be differences. And we may see that these folks who came in at 65, 64 just stay in. Yeah, we might. But this is of people who are currently working, currently not working. The other interesting part about this, I'll just do the next slide, but that's a very good question. Thanks for clarifying that. Okay, so she looked at these two groups, and what she found was the women with low job satisfaction had experienced, I'm sorry, this color is really bad. They're the pink, and purple is for high. So women who did not observe, who did observe sexist behavior, who experienced undermining behaviors and undermining behaviors by the coworkers. Okay, those were the things that caused people to leave engineering. It was the two groups were similar in terms of their age, in terms of their parent status, in terms of their confidence in their engineering skills and their interest in engineering. The difference that came out really strongly was the workplace. That the people who stayed in engineering had good workplaces, they felt supported, all those other good things, and the ones who left the field had not experienced that. So I think that the importance of this study is that the workplace is making a big difference. And when we want to talk about retention, we should be talking about how these workplaces can better support everyone working there. One of the places that I often cite for people to take a look at, okay, these things that employers can do. One of the things I want to mention that's not going to be on this is the ADA initiative. ADA initiative. How many of you have heard of that? Okay, they have some great and interesting, valuable things to do with how you grapple with sexual harassment in the workplace, how you grapple with sort of cultural misunderstandings in the workplace, and I recommend them highly. So what we found in terms of what the FUWAD study came up with, what can employers do? Okay, people want to have clear roles and responsibilities. Training and development, feeling like they were growing was incredibly, that was very important. Many people mentioned that. Being acknowledged for their contributions. These aren't I know this isn't anything surprising, but it's just a good thing to know that these things really made a difference in retention. And rooting out uncivil behavior, one of the things that I show on a slide that we're not going to look at is that women and men in engineering and computing tend to have a wide difference in their stereotype of gender. So in engineering and computing, you see different kinds of stereotypes about gender between women and men. Women being much less stereotyped in the sort of traditional role, and men being tending to have more stereotypical views. So it's a particular challenge when you talk about uncivil behavior. Even benevolent things like trying to protect a female coworker, which is a nice thing to do and should be nice, is actually not necessarily helpful in the long run. Oh, and the last thing I'll say is that this is our report. It is on the web now, and we're very excited about it. We have all of our slides, many of which you didn't see, but you can download them for yourself and use them and do whatever you like with them. So thank you.
All right, let's thank our speakers one more time.